And do you think that we discussed creating engaging products and designing engaging products that a big element to something creating an engagement is the story, which I kind of equate to the brand, like the enduring
Yep.
idea, right? Do you feel like that's part of it?
I think there's 2 parts of it. One, it's always the story no matter what. And whenever we acquire something on Rally, whether it's a baseball card or a painting or a dinosaur fossil, we always make sure that the one that we have has the most compelling story. So, our Honus Wagner card, which is the most famous card in all of sports, it's got this story that this amazing baseball player of his era in 1907, he was just as good as Babe Ruth. Wagner didn't want his card with cigarettes, whether it was for kids or licensing or whatever, and that's how they sold baseball cards in the early 1900s. It was in a pack of cigarettes. So he stopped the presses. Only 20 of those cards, 20, 30 got out there in private collections now, but it's the most valuable cards in sports. That's its own story. Our story, the one of our exact example, was one that saved a monastery, that somebody who was in the neighborhood worked at that monastery. He left a safety deposit box when he passed away, and it had this $500,000 card inside of it with a note that said, "This should save the monastery." And that's how it worked. And that's the story for that individual card. And then that story kind of compounds over time. It becomes that telephone game. And I think that that's the biggest part. When I look at storytelling, you want the story that goes with an asset. That's what creates value. That's why the Mona Lisa is as expensive as it is because of the heist and it got stolen. It was a crazy story behind the Mona Lisa. It's part of the reason it's so valuable, it's so important, is because of the story that went with it, not because of the actual painting. Over time, that story becomes something that becomes legendary, it becomes urban legend. By the time it's retold, I have my own version of the story, you have your own version of the story, but it lives infinitely. I think that to me is the saddest part of design right now. And this goes back to a little bit of what you know better than I do, is walking into any convenience store at this point, and every CPG brand looks identical. Every single can, every single package. It's the death of detail when it comes to design that we used to have. And the stories are sacrificed too. Over time, those stories kind of blend together. And the story is just like, oh, it's a pretty can, but you're all selling the same thing. And I think we've hit that inflection point where the storytelling is paramount and not just the story of the product, the story behind the brand, behind the people that built it, become way, way more part of the conversation than just like pretty packaging and minimalist packaging. We've gotten to a point that we need more Mona Lisas than Damien Hirst.
Absolutely. I have a painting in my office and we didn't spend a lot of money on it, but my wife and I, when we were recently married, went to Uganda and we were in the city of Jinja, which is where the source of the Nile is, and, went rafting, had all these really amazing experiences. And then she paid this local artist to make it. And at the time we were in college. So I was like, oh, we don't have money for this. But I'm looking at it right now and it's not the painting, it's the story behind it, right? Like how we got to have that painting is what makes me proud. I think another great example, I worked at my mom's furniture store. It was a consignment shop. So there was a lot of unique furniture and home accessories. One
Dude,
of them was,
that is an awesome start to a career, man. That is like in a consignment furniture shop where you get to meet crazy people and see awesome things. That's an amazing start to a design career too.
well, it's, you see what people value and why they would buy some aged sofa, or because they usually tell you the story of why they'd value it and why they're willing to pay for it. Successful executives' wives would frequent there. They'd go there to hang out and browse and maybe buy something. And so this one very successful guy, he found this B-2 bomber, this World War II bomber, it was like a little like figurine that you'd hang on the ceiling. And he said, oh, this is similar to the bombers that they used in the Battle of Midway. They were not very agile. Like it was basically like the chances of dying on a bombing run were pretty high because you had to do a nosedive on top of what you were going to bomb before you released the bomb. And then you'd have to pull up. And a lot of them, couldn't pull up. And so he said, whenever you're having a bad day, it could always be worse. Like the technology could always be worse. I bought that figurine that night because of
There
the
it is.
story.
Oh, that's
There it is.
dude.
There.
But that's also the reason that prices exist the way they do. The reason secondary markets exist, and the reason that you can have certain products like furniture. The reason those can exist is because design is so strong, the story is so strong. You can create a world that has a high and low for each one. So you can have the $7,000 version of a chair, and then you get the $500 version on eBay. Everybody in their own world is happy to have it and has a little story behind it. You can support multiple levels of a market that way too. It's crazy to see certain products that are just bland, don't have a story, they come and go. And that's why design has gotten so disposable at this point. So when we see A Honus Wagner card is a great example. I bring that one up a lot because it is this very specific thing to Rally, but it's also this in the world of collecting. It's ultra well known. It has 11 different stories that tell themselves at this point. The company that wound up owning the licensing for it made, 20, 30 different reprints. And those within themselves have active secondary markets. And that's been going on every 10 years, basically, for the last 30 or 40 years. They put out a new version of it. It's something that's so strong, and the market around it, the story around it is so strong. You can support multiple levels of a marketplace, and even new generations who have no idea what that brand actually means or what that person actually was are going to purchase it. It's the same thing for Jordan brand sneakers. You see these kids who come into, like, we have a museum space here in New York, and we had one of the first pairs of Jordan ones that Michael Jordan ever wore on the court that are on display. So when you see a 14-year-old or 15-year-old come in, they know exactly what that sneaker is. They know nothing about Michael Jordan. Like, the Michael Jordan story in itself has taken on so many different iterations, so many versions. Now they know him as this guy with a hoop earring that Drake hangs out with that has a sneaker. They don't know him as this basketball player who dominated the 90s like I do and my generation does. Design is a huge part of it, but the heritage behind something, the legacy and the story are what allow a brand or a product to live forever, infinitely, in a million different iterations. The ones that have been around for 30 or 40 years. It's hard for me to look at products that come out now and say and objectively give it an opinion that they're going to be around 20 or 30 years from now.